One could argue that no single person has influenced Chinese culture more than Confucius, commonly known as Confucius. Confucius was born around 551 BC in what today is Shan Tzu province. He started off with humble origins. His father died when he was a child, and he was raised by a poor mother. Despite his great places Confucius would one day rise to, he never forgot his humble beginning, nor the common people he grew up with. His life started off normal enough, but when he completed his studies, he began to teach in his 20s. He quickly began to be recognized for his wisdom, and his reputation grew, attracting many disciples. Although his followers loved him, and he had much success as a teacher, Confucius's real ambition was for politics, an ambition that was extremely difficult for him to achieve, due to the political leaders of that time being intimidated by his reputation. He did briefly hold an office at one point, but had no real authority, and so he eventually resigned. At the age of 50, he went on what he believed to be a divine mission, and traveled all over China advising all of the rulers on how best to improve their governments. Ultimately, his mission failed, as he was rejected again and again by the rulers of the state, and ridiculed by much of the peasantry. Confucius spent his last 15 years living the life of a scholar in his home state, and died in 479 BC, at the age of 72. Although his political career failed, he was undoubtedly one of the greatest teachers who ever lived, resembling the Greek philosopher Socrates in many ways. Confucius was a one-man university. He was well versed in history, poetry, government, propriety, mathematics, music, divination, and sports. Confucius was tough on his students and expected much out of them, but after lessons, he was very cheery and loved to have a good time with them. He was humble enough to admit when he was wrong, yet he was unwavering when it came to defending what he believed in, especially in matters protecting the peasant class against oppressive rulers. Confucius held himself to the highest standard and never sold out to the rulers, instead choosing to maintain his integrity. After his death, his teaching began to spread like wildfire, and he quickly became known as the mentor and model of 10,000 generations, a nickname relatively accurate considering over 2,000 years later, every child in China grows up poring over Confucian texts, and government officials are required to be well versed in his teachings. Confucianism is perhaps most famous for its short moral maxims such as, "Is not he a true philosopher who, though he be unrecognized, cherishes no resentment? What you do not wish done to yourself, do not do to others. To go too far is as bad as to fall short. Feel kindly toward everyone, but be intimate only with the virtuous." Part of the reason Confucius's teachings took off in China was the state of anarchy it had deteriorated into. The ruling dynasty had collapsed, and China broke into various states and warred with each other. The brutality of these conflicts peaked in the century after Confucius died. There are even reports of up to 400,000 civilians being slaughtered in one massacre. What China needed more than ever was something to bring all these warring states together in harmony. Confucius's genius was to figure out exactly why the once relatively peaceful China had erupted into such chaos. At one point, China was unified by tradition that was passed down from their ancestors. Respect for this tradition unified the people as a cohesive group. Somewhere along the line, they had lost some respect for the knowledge passed down by their ancestors and abandoned much of their tradition, causing their group identity to shatter, and it created conflict. In the absence of this group identity, individuals who were out for themselves alone began to fight with each other. Now, the rulers of that time had a very realistic view and basically saw human nature as fundamentally greedy, selfish, short-sighted, and violent. To counteract this flawed human nature, they attempted to come up with lengthy systems of detailed laws that would reward people when they acted the way the government wanted, and punish them when they did not act accordingly. Despite these efforts, they did not seem to solve the problem, and Confucius was unimpressed with this solution. For he saw this solution as just a band-aid for external circumstances for these conflicts, rather than an internal solution that the problem really needed if they were to truly fix things. For example, a government can create laws regarding marriage and divorce. However, they cannot force people to actually love each other. For that, people need to find their own meaning and motivation, two things that the government cannot provide on an individual level. Now, some schools of thought suggested that love was the answer to China's problems, but Confucius saw that solution for what it was, an end goal without any practical way to get there. Instead, Confucius was much more interested in how people's group identity shaped their attitude towards the world. At the core of Confucius's solution was strict adherence to tradition. As the world became more modern, many of the traditions that bound villages together started falling apart. With these bonds gone, they lost their group identity with the surrounding culture, and slowly but surely, they began to fight with each other. Tradition usually comes about spontaneously after many years of observed patterns of behavior. Confucius realized this was no longer happening spontaneously, and so people must create and follow tradition deliberately, with conscious effort. Once a tradition had been established, it was essential for people to start celebrating it. It should be taught in schools and religious organizations. Social events like festivals and parades are effective tools in reinforcing people's reverence for tradition. In Confucianism, there are 5 key terms to denote aspects of establishing deliberate tradition. The first one is called Zen. Zen is the ideal relationship people should have with each other. It is sometimes translated as human-heartedness. This calls for respect for all human life, including oneself. Courtesy, unselfishness, and respect are all essential principles. Not only should we not do bad to others that we would not want done to us, but we should actively go out of our way to do nice things for people that we would appreciate in return. The next term is called Shan Tzu. Shan Tzu addresses the method in which we maintain our relationship with others. It is the opposite of petty and could be described as mature. This term states that we reap what we sow. Shan Tzu, if practiced properly, we can achieve a sense of ease and self-respect by seeking to put others at ease and showing others respect. The next term is Li. Li designates what is proper. Confucius believed that if every individual was left to their own devices to decide what constitutes manners, it would lead to chaos. He taught that manners and social grace should be a universally agreed upon procedure, and that these manners should be taught. Now, what constitutes good manners can be drastically different with varying cultures, but the most important part is that these manners are agreed upon and systemized. Furthermore, one crucial aspect of Li is the respect of elders and ancestors. The fourth concept is Te, which directly translates to power. This power specifically refers to the government. Confucius thought that if the government truly wished to be successful, they must set a moral example, and the leaders must cherish their people's trust above all other things. If people do not have confidence in their government, it is doomed to fail. The final term is Wen. Wen refers to the great art that culture produces. In Confucius's opinion, there is no better sign that a culture or nation is thriving in times of peace than their production of great artwork, and that the arts should be celebrated and much pride should be taken in them. Part of the genius of Confucius's method is that when deliberate tradition is set up properly, it can be passed down along from generation to generation and be sustained long term. Equally important is the fact that it teaches that authority must be earned rather than given. This helps prevent leaders from taking advantage of the Confucius system. By changing the way people treat others, Confucianism in turn changed people themselves on the inside. Up to this point, Confucianism has sounded more like a set of ethics rather than a religion in its classical sense. Although much of Confucianism is practical, there is a transcendental element that qualifies it as a religion. Like most ancient Chinese belief systems, Confucianism views reality as a relationship between heaven and earth. The common beliefs of that time worshipped dead ancestors in heaven by making sacrifices in honor of them. Confucius inherited these beliefs. However, his teachings taught us to focus more on how we behave on earth rather than making sacrifices to heaven. He instead taught that we must overcome our own egoism and selfishness and add something to the community to honor the ancestors and earn our rightful place in heaven. The effect of Confucian teachings is self-evident and have profoundly influenced China for over 2,000 years, which is a quarter of the world's population. Confucianism became the official state religion of China in 54 AD and is still taught in schools today. This in turn allowed China to grow from the perpetual state of civil war into the stable nation that thrives today. Confucianism spread to most of the other countries in East Asia, helped by the fact that other religions can easily be integrated into Confucian ideology, for they can become a part of the deliberate tradition itself.